Welcome, everyone. This is December 2017, the Champion Group. We are so excited to share with you how to maximize your first of the year fundraiser. We're going to get right into the nuts and bolts of this whole thing, but I'd like to introduce you first to Don Carmichael. He is our CEO and founder of the Champion Group. Don has been in fundraising his whole life and has just brought amazing ideas to the table and has helped literally thousands of organizations across the United States and Canada to hit their all-time fundraising records. Don, we're so excited for you to bring us some new truth today on how to maximize that beginning of the year, which seems to always kind of be kind of slow and kind of, school starting again or back to the grindstone. So would you just kind of enlighten us on some new ideas?
Sure will. Well, thank you all for joining. And for those of you who are watching us afterwards on the recorded version, I'm very excited to be sharing some ideas that I think can help you regardless of the type of organization you're in. And right now, where we're holding this webinar, we are in December. We're approaching Christmas. Things are a little crazy in people's lives. And there's a frantic process right now going on in terms of fundraising appeals. And if you look statistically, literally 31% of all individual donor giving in an entire year occurs in the month of December. And not only that, 12% of all individual donor giving throughout an entire year, 12% of that total giving occurs in the last 48 hours of December. So not only is it...
Really? Wait. The last 48 hours?
Last 48 hours of December, 12% of all individual giving occurs.
Wow. Would never have seen that.
We're just in a crazy time right now. And I know for many of you that are watching this and joining us that you are sort of in a downward slope, just counting the days and hours down until Christmas and where we have break. So really the topic for today's short webinar is what are some effective things you can do to maximize your first of the year fundraising? And I'd like to just walk through a few tips. This will be fairly brief today, but just give you some ideas of things that we've observed and learned over the years, and hopefully this will be a blessing to you. Quick introduction for those of you who do not know who we are. We are the Champion Group. We are a small mission-focused company based in Birmingham, Alabama. We have 15 employees in the U.S. and 6 staff in Canada. We actually bring the results from over 2,600 major fundraising events conducted in 48 states in the U.S. and throughout coast to coast in Canada. And one of the things that really excites us is that these events have raised well over $100 million to date. We're considered by many, including our competition, as a best-in-class leader in the industry that we serve. And bottom line, our heart is mission. We believe more money will enable greater mission impact and will give your organization greater mission options to do the job that you've been called to do. So starting off, just a couple of quick questions. First of all, what is your major fundraising plan for this coming January through March timeframe period, basically the first quarter of next year? So what is your fundraising plan? And maybe secondly, do you even have a major fundraising plan?
I was going to say that, Don. I was like, who even has a plan yet? I mean, we're all thinking about Christmas presents and pumpkin pie.
That's right. And so it's a distracted time. And many times if you're not careful, you'll find yourself sitting here towards the end of the year, going into next year without a really solid plan in place. And many people that will probably be watching this may already have some plans in place for the upcoming spring season. But are those good plans? Are those plans that can generate a significant amount of money to your organization as well as significant numbers of donors? So I'd like to take you through about 5 fundraising tips that you can consider as you look at maximizing this first part of the year. Tip number 1, this sounds boring, but it's actually extremely important. That is, define next year's master fundraising plan. We have found that over 90% of the organizations that we talk to, and this crosses all sectors in the nonprofit world, schools, faith-based schools, ministries, select charities, we found that over 90% of these organizations have no master fundraising plan. And if all it is taking a piece of paper and writing down what your strategy is for this coming year, that's better than having no plan. So when you look at your plan, the first thing you need to look at is what does your budget need? If you're a school, especially if you're a Christian school or faith-based school, we know that your fiscal year is going to end in June and probably start back in July. But what is your budgeted shortfall? Because most schools operate with a shortfall. What's your strategy to fund that shortfall? How are you doing right now in terms of your progress towards meeting that? Secondly, as you are defining next year's master fundraising plan, one thing to consider that I believe is very important, and I would say this holds true with almost every organization, and it's a best practice of never do more than 2 major fundraisers per year. Now, there are exceptions, but if you're a part of a school looking at this, I would say hard and fast, never do more than 2 major fundraisers. If you're a small organization with a fairly small volunteer base or small donor base, same rule applies. Don't do more than 2 events because you'll just wear everybody out. So, and when you look at what type of fundraisers, 2 major fundraisers should you do, one of those fundraisers, in our opinion, should always be a fundraiser that adds new donors to your donor base. There's actually a philosophy and there's a principle in nonprofit fundraising that says new donors are the lifeblood of every nonprofit. And there's a real ring of truth to that. If you're not consistently looking at bringing new donors into a relationship with your organization, then over time you're going to lose to attrition a lot of your current donors, and your donations are going to go down and down, and you'll find yourself in a very difficult financial place. So one fundraiser should always be adding new donors. The best type of fundraising event to do that would be something like a walkathon, or uses that model where you use your existing participants to call their friends and family anywhere in the country saying, hey, would you sponsor me in this event for this great cause? People will give money very generously because of relationship. And even if they've never met you before, they'll be sending you checks directly to your organization. So one of your, yeah, go ahead, Edna.
Just want to jump in. Would you explain, because one of my questions I would immediately have if I was watching this webinar is, what does a person in Maine care about a fundraiser in Georgia? So how does that really impact, like, how do we get outside of our little community to ask for more donations?
Yeah.
Does that really bother anybody?
Well, you think it might. And let me add another question, and I'm going to answer both with the same answer.
Okay.
What if you're in a small or even a larger community, but you're in an economically depressed area, and everybody in town is sort of economically depressed? How can you get new donors, and how can you find donors? Well, whether you're in an economically depressed area, looking outside of that area for donations, or if you're let's use your Georgia example, you're in Georgia, why in the world would somebody in Maine or Washington State or Alaska want to give? If you're thinking about a walkathon type of a model, and it could be a walkathon, it could be almost any event where your participants raise money like the walkathon, where they say, hey, would you sponsor me in this event? The reason the donor gives is not because of the cause and not because of the location, but because of the person. They give to people they care about. And the most important principle in fundraising is that people give to people they know and trust. So if somebody called me from another part of the country saying, would you sponsor me? And they're a friend of mine, I'll say, sure. And all of a sudden I become a first-time donor to that organization. Now, I still need to be developed in that relationship to give on a regular basis. But that's the whole idea here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Tip number 2, personally thank your recently now prior year-end givers. So if you're in January, you will have had quite a few people that probably just gave to your organization just in the preceding December. Because as we just mentioned a moment ago, 31% of all annual giving by individuals happens in December. So don't forget to thank them. That's one of the things you need to do, because as you thank them, it gives you a chance to build a relationship. I would actually pick up the phone and I would call everybody that's given over a certain dollar amount. Maybe it's $100, maybe it's even $50, so that you're building that relationship. That relationship is going to come into play this coming year to help you potentially give more. So tip number 1, define your master fundraising plan for the year. Tip number 2, personally thank your prior year-end givers. Tip number 3, and this is an interesting question or tip, avoid fundraising in January. Regina, I know we had a chance to talk earlier. Now you're online with us. What do you think is a reason that we would say avoid fundraising in January?
Because everyone has spent their money in December.
That's exactly right. January is actually the worst month of the year to raise money, because most people overblow their budget in December with giving. And if you look at giving trends with different charities, ministries, Christian schools, you'll see usually that January month is when you see a real dip. So just understand that you don't want to actually be asking for money in January. Whatever you're doing first of the year, I would say try to target that or position that so that you're actually raising money in February and beyond. However, there's an interesting exception, and that would be with corporate sponsors. A lot of corporate sponsors, and we're going to touch on this in about just a few minutes because, again, this is going to be a very short webinar, but corporate sponsors are very viable for even January because many companies now are moving towards a new trend where they set aside a certain allocation of how much they're willing to give in their community budget for the year. And once it's gone, it's gone. In fact, if you're calling many of those companies right now, or even back in August, September, many of them will tell you, hey, we've already given our allotment for the year, call us next year. Well, that means January rolls around, most of those companies are on calendar fiscal years, call them in January, and many of them would be viable. So tip number 3, avoid fundraising in January. All right, tip number 4, some ideas of short timeline winter fundraising event options. Now, the revenue model is the really key here, but there are 3 events that you can do indoors that are fairly common, and then I want to present a 4th idea. Number 1, and the reason indoor events are important in the wintertime is because obviously in most parts of the country it's winter, it's cold, it's not conducive to being outdoors. So these 3 ideas are indoor events for those outside of the Florida and California sunbelts. Number 1, bowling events. As the picture in the middle, bowling can be done year-round, doesn't matter if it's raining or snowing. Number 2, mall walks. And I would suggest whether you're doing a bowling event, the mall walk, or even what we call serve-a-thons. Serve-a-thons would be where you develop a variety of projects that your teams are going out to do fundraising, service projects, actually. And so if you're a school, typically each class or grade would adopt a project. Might be in inner city areas or nursing homes. The picture you see here on the right is a group of young students in an inner city rescue mission preparing meals. But regardless of the event, the model is you want those individuals raising money through personal sponsors, not through entry fees or other methods that are very limited. Now, there is an interesting 4th short timeline winter fundraising event option, and you may or may not be familiar with it, but it's the whole idea of the non-banquet event. It's the banquet non-event that has different names. You may have gotten one of these invitations. I did recently, and I've sent them out in the past, where it's you are cordially invited to not attend our winter non-event banquet, our winter non-banquet. Instead of paying for babysitters and braving the elements to come out for an evening dinner of chicken and Jell-O, instead, would you stay home and enjoy your evening with your family? And would you consider sending us, in lieu of that, basically a donation? Sometimes it's tied into as an RSVP or a pledge. But non-banquet events, sort of the beauty in those events is if you haven't seen them around your community before, they probably are going to be very novel and well received. And there are no logistics that you have to organize. You're not having to come up with catering, venue rentals, invitations, other than just that one invitation. All you're doing is basically doing a direct mailing that has a clever packaging. So these are some ideas of some very short timeline winter event options that you can consider if you need some income cash flow wise, but you're not looking for significant. None of these events would be what I would consider a major fundraising event option, but they could fit for short timeline events if you have some immediate cash needs. Tip number 5, and this is the last of the 5 tips. I told you all this would be a short webinar today. But tip number 5 is solicit corporate sponsors now, starting in January, for an event you plan later in the spring. And this would give you some runway, if you will, towards a major fundraising event option that would occur not in the first quarter necessarily, but probably late March, April, or May time period. So number 1, schedule a major spring fundraising event. Typically April would be in most cases best. The key here is you want to set your event date at least 2 weeks after spring break is over. That way you're not putting spring break right in the middle of an event planning campaign and disrupting it with a drop in momentum. If it's at least 2 weeks after spring break, what we've seen is you've got time to re-energize your families if it's a school. If you're a non-school organization, spring break affects you too. So know what your spring breaks are in your community and try to plan your dates at least 2 weeks after spring break when people are sort of back in routine. If you were to schedule an event in April, and why April? Well, April is going to get you far enough down the road that you have at least 3 to 4 months of planning timeline between basically now and that date. So you have enough time to put into place what you would need to raise a significant amount of money. Also, if you're especially if you're a school, and then if you're a non-school that still has school-age families connected to you, you really want to avoid May, at least late May, because that's when everything gets really crazy in schools with graduations and people are taking off on summer vacations. So even though we do many, many successful major funding events in May, I do believe it gives you a better edge if you do April instead for those reasons. Now, by identifying a major event in the spring, it gives you a chance to start going after corporate sponsors in January, and not only corporate sponsors, but also underwriters. Underwriters are typically business sponsors that give $5,000 or higher. And they're giving those higher amounts because they have some type of connection to your organization, and they really have a desire to help you, but they're writing those checks out of their business account, so they have to be able to justify that as a corporate sponsor, if you will. So corporate sponsors, underwriters, they're interconnected. The underwriter is just the higher level of those two. So what does that do for your organization? Number one, it means you can generate immediate revenue. And number two, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, many companies now that have moved towards funding an annual contribution limit in their budgets and probably just replenish that budget so they have money to give. So very quick recap. Tip number one, define your master fundraising plan. Know what you're going to do. Never do more than 2 events as part of that. But in the process, this is going to help you identify what you are going to do and those things that you aren't. So now you're going to be more focused and you're going to be more intentional with your volunteers, so you're not having to deal with volunteer burnout from a bunch of high output, low yield fundraising activities. Number 2, remember to thank your prior year-end donors, because you want to keep that relationship and build it so they will give this year as well. Number 3, avoid asking for money in January. Why? Because people are pretty much broke after Christmas. Number 4, if you have an immediate need for cash flow, you could consider some short timeline winter events that are indoor events. They won't necessarily generate a huge amount of money, but they can generate some, and it may be enough for an organization to meet its short-term budget needs. And finally, 5, solicit corporate sponsors and underwriters now for a major event that you plan in the spring. This is the final slide here. I hope this information has been helpful, even if it's just 1 or 2 nuggets. It's interesting, regardless of the type of organization, whether it's school or non-school or local nonprofit or charity, you'll find that these dynamics really affect all of us. So hopefully this will give you some ideas as you go forward. As you're winding down towards Christmas, 2 things. 1, we would be delighted to serve you in any way completely free. If you have any ideas or questions, or you want to bounce some ideas off of us, things that maybe we've seen that work well or don't work, please give us a call, because we exist to serve and to help. As I mentioned at the outset, we believe money enables you to have a greater set of mission options, and we want to be part of helping you help your people. And then secondly, as we're coasting into the next few weeks over Christmas, just wanted to wish you and your family just a terrific Merry Christmas, blessings on you and what you're doing. I just hope you end up closing your year out very well and finish strong. And anything else that you might want to add to this before we wrap up our webinar?
No, thank you so much, Don. I just think this is just such amazing information as we continue to look how we can fund our needs. That we've all been called to these different missions, right? And so we have to figure out how to fund these missions. And I just believe this is a great way to kind of get some nuggets to rally. I would say the one thing I would add is just be intentional, be on purpose. These things don't just happen, so you have to really set your calendar, especially with the follow-up and the thank you and getting those new donors cultivated. You really have to be intentional on it. So we're here for you. We're excited to work with you, and just know that we're here to give you any type of free coaching we can. The telephone number is right here. Just give us a call, and we'll get right back to you. Thank you so much for attending, and have a blessed Christmas season.
Thank you. Thank you, Edna, and everybody else. Take care.